Snow had been threatening all afternoon, the sky pressing low and pale over the village of Fernley, when the scream cut through the vicarage like a cracked bell. It came from the east wing, from the room that everyone still called the Blue Guest Room, though its wallpaper had faded to a tired grey. By the time the household gathered in the corridor, the scream had already settled into silence, thick and accusing. Colonel Arbuthnot lay sprawled on the rug, one hand extended toward the locked door, as though he had tried to escape through it. His face, once ruddy and commanding, was now drained of colour, his eyes open in startled reproach. The fire in the grate burned steadily, untouched. The windows were shut, latched from the inside. The door was locked, and the key lay on the small writing desk beneath the window. There was no weapon in sight. It was December 22nd, 3 days before Christmas, and the house was full. Fernley Vicarage always was at Christmas, relatives, old friends, and the occasional stranger who arrived by accident and stayed by invitation. Colonel Arbuthnot had been one such guest, arriving 2 weeks earlier in a hired motor car, his luggage neatly labelled, his manner impeccably polite. He had said he was passing through on his way north, but somehow he had never quite left. Each morning there was a reason to delay, a letter expected, a motor car needing repair, a snowfall that made the roads uncertain. By now his presence had settled into the house like an extra piece of furniture, oddly noticeable and yet oddly taken for granted. The discovery of his body shattered that illusion of harmless permanence. Mrs. Dane, the vicar's sister, was the first to recover herself enough to notice the detail that everyone else overlooked in their shock. "The holly," she said faintly, pointing to the mantelpiece. A sprig of it lay there, its red berries bright against the stone. One berry was missing. At first, the clue seemed almost decorative, the sort of festive accident that Christmas encouraged. Holly was everywhere in the house, tucked into banisters, wreaths, and bowls. Yet this sprig was different. It had been placed carefully, deliberately, as though to be seen. The missing berry suggested a child's mischief, or perhaps a bird, but there were no birds indoors, and no children had been in the Blue Guest Room all day. The village constable arrived, stamping snow from his boots, bringing with him the smell of cold air and the weight of official procedure. He examined the door, the windows, the key. He confirmed what everyone already knew. No one could have entered or left the room once it had been locked. The colonel had been alive at tea time. By dinner he was dead. Suspects were plentiful and yet curiously insubstantial. There was the vicar, who had argued with the colonel the previous evening over some forgotten regiment, and a grievance that went back to India. There was Mrs. Dane, who had disliked the colonel's condescending manner, and had been heard to remark that some people simply outstay their welcome. There was Miss Plowden, a distant cousin, who had been seen speaking urgently with the colonel in the garden that morning, her face pale, her gloves clenched tight in her hands. And then there were the servants, each with their own movements and silences, each insisting they had been elsewhere when the colonel met his end. Yet motive alone did not explain the locked room, the absent weapon, the curious holly sprig. The constable, honest and thorough, grew increasingly uncomfortable. Every explanation he offered collapsed under its own weight. Poison would have required access, but the tea things were untouched. A blow to the head would have left marks. Strangulation would have disturbed the room. Nothing fit. Everything was too neat, too complete. As dusk fell and the first real snow began to settle, the house took on a peculiar, uneasy stillness. The colonel's body was removed, but his presence lingered, heavier than before. It was as though he truly had never left, even now. Conversations dropped into whispers. Doors were closed softly. The sprig of holly remained on the mantelpiece, no one quite daring to move it. It was then, as the lamps were being lit and the constable prepared to send for further assistance, that a small, elderly woman arrived from the neighbouring village, shaking snow from her hat and apologising for the inconvenience. Miss Jane Marple had come for Christmas, she explained, at her friend's invitation. She paused in the hallway, her mild eyes taking in the strained faces, the locked door, the lingering scent of smoke and pine. "Dear me," she said gently, noticing the holly at once. "How very curious." Miss Marple did not ask questions at once. She never did. Instead, she allowed herself to be led into the drawing-room, where the household had gathered in uneasy clusters, and accepted a cup of tea she did not drink. Her eyes moved constantly, not in a searching way, but gently, as though she were admiring embroidery. Yet nothing escaped her, the way Mrs. Dane's hands trembled despite her composed expression, the vicar's habit of rubbing his spectacles against his sleeve when he was troubled, the servants' careful attention to one another rather than to their employers. When the constable began explaining the situation, Miss Marple listened with the air of someone being told a story she might later repeat, faithfully and in detail. She nodded at the mention of the locked door, murmured sympathy at the absence of a weapon, and showed particular interest in the sprig of holly. "Holly is very traditional," she said softly, "though one does usually take care not to drop the berries. They stain dreadfully." The constable, relieved to have a listener who did not challenge him, led her to the blue guest room. Miss Marple paused at the threshold, her head tilted slightly, as if listening for something only she could hear. The room was just as it had been described, orderly, masculine, faintly impersonal. A military man's room, tidy to the point of severity. The fire had burned low now, and the air smelled faintly of coal and pine resin. She walked directly to the writing desk and examined the key. "Keys," she observed, "have a habit of travelling, don't they? One puts them down for a moment, and they appear somewhere else entirely. It was there when we broke in," the constable said. "No sign it's been moved." "Quite," said Miss Marple. She did not argue, merely smiled and turned her attention to the rug. The colonel had fallen forward, that much was clear, but the rug itself was slightly askew, its edge no longer aligned with the hearth. A small thing, easily dismissed as the result of the body's collapse. Miss Marple bent, adjusted her spectacles, and sniffed. "Holly again," she murmured. A single crushed leaf lay. Near the rug's corner, its stem snapped cleanly. There was no berry attached. She straightened slowly and moved to the mantelpiece. The sprig there had been cut neatly, not torn, and the berries, save one, were firm and unblemished. "One would think," she said to no one in particular, "that if a berry were to fall accidentally, it might be found somewhere nearby." The constable shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "We searched the room thoroughly." "I'm sure you did," Miss Marple replied kindly. "But sometimes what one is searching for determines what one sees." Back in the drawing-room, she allowed the conversation to resume around her. Miss Plowden was explaining her earlier meeting with the colonel, her voice tight with a mixture of resentment and fear. He had known her father, she said, and had threatened to reveal something damaging unless she helped him financially. Mrs. Dane seized upon this eagerly, as though relieved to direct suspicion away from herself. Miss Marple watched Miss Plowden closely. The young woman spoke convincingly, but when she mentioned the colonel's threats, she glanced involuntarily toward the door, as though expecting him to appear. It was the look of someone accustomed to being watched, not of someone newly frightened. Later, when the servants were questioned, Miss Marple noticed a different sort of tension. The parlour-maid, Emily, answered plainly, until the holly was mentioned. Then she hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the hall where a bowl of greenery stood. "I was decorating this morning," she said, "but I didn't go into the blue guest room after luncheon." "No," said Miss Marple gently, "of course not. But you would know, wouldn't you, if a sprig were missing a berry?" Emily flushed. "They do fall sometimes, miss. They do," Miss Marple agreed, though usually when they've dried. As evening settled in, the constable grew more certain, and yet more confused. Everyone had a reason to dislike the colonel. No one had a clear opportunity. Miss Marple, however, seemed content to knit quietly by the fire, her needles clicking softly as though marking time. It was only when the vicar mentioned, almost in passing, that the colonel had insisted on locking his door every night as a habit of war, that Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Every night?" she asked. "Even when he was expecting company?" The vicar frowned. "I suppose so. He was a cautious man." "Yes," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "very cautious indeed." She returned to her knitting, but her eyes were alight now, and the image of a missing berry, a shifted rug, and a guest who never quite left was beginning quietly to arrange itself into a pattern. Morning came reluctantly to Fernley, the snow-muting sound and colour alike. The vicarage felt smaller by daylight, its rooms crowded with the weight of what had happened there. Miss Marple was up early, sitting at the breakfast table with her knitting, when the questioning resumed in earnest. The constable had decided, with a mixture of relief and resignation, to allow her to listen. He told himself it was kindness to an elderly lady, but he had already begun to rely on the steadiness of her presence. Mrs. Dane was called first. She spoke briskly, as though determined to clear the unpleasant business from her mind. Yes, she had disliked Colonel Arbuthnot. He was pompous, overbearing, and far too interested in other people's affairs. But dislike was hardly murder, she said, and she had spent the afternoon writing letters in the morning room. She even produced them, neat pages in her firm hand, each dated and sealed. Miss Marple admired the envelopes. "How very efficient," she said. "Though I wonder, did you always date your letters before posting them?" Mrs. Dane hesitated only for a fraction of a second. "Of course, it saves confusion." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "Though I notice yesterday's post was delayed by the snow, one might be tempted to finish a letter begun earlier, mightn't one?" The constable frowned, but Mrs. Dane's composure returned quickly. She smiled, thin and patient, as if indulging a child. The vicar came next, clearly distressed by the proceedings. He admitted the argument with the colonel, but insisted it had been of no real consequence. Old men, he said, quarrelled over old memories. He had been in his study preparing a sermon all afternoon, a fact supported by the scattered books and notes found there. "And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "you left your study several times, did you not? To fetch more coal, I believe, and once to look for the scissors." The vicar blinked. "Yes, but only briefly. Brief moments," she agreed, "are sometimes quite long enough." Miss Plowden's account was more emotional. She admitted the colonel had been blackmailing her, but insisted she had refused him outright. She had gone walking afterward, she said, to clear her head, and had returned only just before dinner. Her cheeks flushed as she spoke, her hands twisting in her lap. Miss Marple watched her with sympathetic eyes. "Walking in the snow can be very bracing," she said, "though one does tend to bring half the garden indoors on one's shoes." Miss Plowden glanced down sharply, then smiled with forced lightness. "I wiped my boots." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "Still, holly leaves are remarkably persistent." The servants were questioned again, this time with greater care. Emily, the parlour-maid, maintained she had not entered the blue guest-room after luncheon, but admitted she had dusted the corridor outside. The cook insisted she had been in the kitchen from 3 o'clock onward, though the constable noted that no one had seen her there between 4 and D5. The gardener, who had helped carry in firewood earlier, swore he had not gone near the east wing. Each account, taken alone, seemed plausible. Together they formed a pattern of small evasions and careful truths. Miss Marple listened, knitting steadily, her needles clicking softly like a clock counting down. It was during a pause, when everyone believed the questioning finished, that she spoke again. "Colonel Arbuthnot was a man who valued privacy," she said. "And yet he stayed, did he not, far longer than intended? One wonders why." No one answered. The silence was thick, uncomfortable. "He locked his door every night," she continued, "and yesterday afternoon as well, it seems. That suggests he was expecting something, or someone, he did not entirely trust." Mrs. Dane drew herself up. "Are you suggesting one of us threatened him?" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple replied mildly, "that he may have been afraid of being interrupted." The constable leaned forward. "Interrupted doing what?" Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the window, where the snow lay undisturbed beneath the holly bushes. "Settling accounts, perhaps, or staging a little drama of his own." She rose then, slowly, and asked to see the hallway decorations once more. As she examined the bowl of holly, she selected a sprig and turned it in her fingers. "You see," she said, "berries do not fall off quite so neatly unless they have been handled." Her gaze moved from face to face, resting a moment longer on those who seemed too ready, too eager to agree with her. Beneath their words, she sensed impatience, fear, and calculation. The voices of deception were growing louder now, and though the full truth remained just out of reach, Miss Marple was certain of one thing: someone in that house knew exactly how the colonel had died, and why he had never truly left at all. By midday the snow had stopped, leaving the world outside glittering and deceptively clean. Inside the vicarage the atmosphere had grown heavier. Miss Marple felt it keenly, the subtle tightening that occurred when people realized their stories were no longer standing alone but brushing uncomfortably against one another. She asked quite casually about Colonel Arbuthnot's finances. It seemed an innocent enough inquiry, prompted by Miss Plowden's mention of blackmail, yet it produced an immediate ripple of unease. The vicar admitted that the colonel had spoken vaguely of investments gone wrong. Mrs. Dane recalled with pointed emphasis that he had been anxious about a bank letter that never arrived. The cook mentioned that he had complained loudly about the cost of his stay, despite paying generously. "So many anxieties," Miss Marple murmured. "One might think he was a man running out of options." The constable, encouraged, produced the colonel's effects: a wallet with little cash, several letters of an official nature, and a small notebook filled with names and dates. Miss Marple examined it closely. The entries meant nothing to her at first, but she noticed something else. The handwriting shifted slightly toward the end, growing cramped, hurried. "A man under pressure," she said, "or a man afraid of being discovered." Fear, she reflected, was often more dangerous than greed. It led people to act suddenly, clumsily, and yet with terrible determination. She turned her attention next to the matter of opportunity. Mrs. Dane's letters, though neatly dated, were written on paper that matched the stationery kept in the blue guest room. The vicar's study alibi placed him nearby at several points. Miss Plowden's walk coincided conveniently with the narrow window of time in which the crime had occurred. Each path led close to the locked door, yet none crossed it directly. And yet, Miss Marple said, the room was locked. Kept from the inside. The constable sighed. "That's what troubles me most." "It should," she replied gently, "because it suggests the lock itself is part of the deception." She asked to see the key again and held it between her fingers. It was ordinary enough, worn smooth by years of use. But keys, she knew, could be turned without locking, removed without securing, replaced without suspicion. She asked whether anyone had tried the door handle before the scream. Mrs. Dane admitted she had passed the corridor and noticed the door was shut, but had not tried it. Emily said she had heard a sound, perhaps the fire shifting, but had thought nothing of it. Miss Plowden claimed she had been nowhere near the east wing at all. So many almosts, Miss Marple said. Almost heard, almost saw, almost knew. As the afternoon wore on, she began gently weaving connections. Colonel Arbuthnot had known Miss Plowden's father during the war. He had served under the vicar's brother. He had once invested with Mrs. Dane's late husband. Everywhere he went he touched old histories, old wounds, old fears. He was not merely a guest, he was a reminder. And reminders, Miss Marple said softly to the constable, are rarely welcome at Christmas. She returned again to the holly. It was not festive sentiment that interested her, but its placement. The crushed leaf by the rug suggested movement, someone standing close, perhaps bending. The missing berry suggested removal, not accident. She imagined it between fingers, small and red, easily hidden. A childish thing, perhaps, but children learn such tricks early. What if, she said at last, the locked room was not meant to keep someone out, but to keep suspicion in? The constable stared at her. "I don't follow. A room locked after death creates an impossibility," she explained. "People stop looking for simple answers. They forget that a door can be locked and a killer still walk free. Greed might explain blackmail. Revenge might explain old quarrels. Jealousy might explain resentment. Fear, however, fear explained the careful planning, the theatrical clue, the insistence on privacy. Someone had needed the colonel silent, and someone else had needed the crime to appear unsolvable. As evening approached, Miss Marple felt the web tightening. Alibis overlapped too neatly. Motives clustered rather than stood alone. The colonel had stayed because he believed himself safe, because he thought control lay with him. He had been wrong. She looked around the drawing room at the people gathered there, each one certain their particular reason was invisible to the others. "You see," she said quietly, "when motives tangle like this, it is usually because more than one person is hiding the same thing, though for very different reasons." No one spoke. Outside, the light was already fading, and the holly berries gleamed darkly against the snow. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, certain now that the maze had an exit. She simply needed to lead them, step by careful step, to its centre. The breakthrough came just after dinner, when the constable returned from the village with flushed cheeks and an air of triumph that lifted the mood of the room at once. He had been speaking with the postmistress, he announced, and she had remembered Colonel Arbuthnot distinctly. The colonel had posted a letter that afternoon, an urgent one, marked private, and had argued sharply with a woman in the queue. A woman matching Miss Plowden's description. Miss Plowden went very pale as the eyes of the room turned toward her. She protested at once, her voice shaking but firm. Yes, she had gone to the village. Yes, she had spoken to the colonel. He had followed her there, she said, to renew his threats, but she had left him alive and well, furious bee. Unharmed. The postmistress, however, had remembered raised voices and a gesture that looked very much like a shove. That places her with him very near the time of death, the constable said, clearly relieved. And she admits motive. Miss Marple said nothing. She watched Miss Plowden carefully, noting the way her hands clenched not in guilt, but in something closer to despair. The constable pressed on. Miss Plowden's walk, her agitation, the blackmail, the argument in public, all of it fitted together neatly now, when a search of her coat pocket produced a single hollyberry, crushed but unmistakable. The room seemed to exhale all at once. "There," said Mrs. Dane sharply. "That settles it." Miss Plowden stared at the berry as though she had never seen it before. "I don't know how that got there," she whispered. "I swear I don't." The constable was kind but firm. He spoke of circumstantial evidence, of emotional strain, of crimes committed in moments of desperation. The locked room, he suggested, could be explained simply. The colonel had locked the door himself, as was his habit. Miss Plowden had confronted him earlier, perhaps poisoned him then, perhaps struck him later. Details to be worked out, but the outline was clear enough. It was all very reasonable, too reasonable. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair. "May I see the berry?" she asked. The constable handed it to her. She examined it closely, then nodded. "Yes," she said, "that is indeed from the same sprig." Mrs. Dane looked triumphant. The vicar looked relieved. Even the servants seemed calmer now, as though a storm had passed. "And yet," Miss Marple added softly, "it troubles me." The constable smiled indulgently. "It's natural to have doubts, Miss Marple, but holly berries," she said, "are rather delicate. If kept in a pocket all afternoon, they tend to burst entirely. This one is crushed, but not split, as though it were placed there more recently." Miss Plowden looked up, hope flickering in her eyes, but the constable shook his head. "That's speculation." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed. "Everything is until it isn't." The decision was made quickly after that. Miss Plowden was to remain under supervision until further inquiries could be completed. The constable spoke of wires to headquarters, of formal statements. There was talk of ending the matter before Christmas, of restoring peace to the house. That was what unsettled Miss Marple most, the eagerness to be finished. As the household dispersed for the night, she lingered in the hallway, gazing at the holly decorations once more. Something about the arrangement troubled her. The bowl was fuller than she remembered, the sprigs more evenly balanced. Emily passed behind her, carrying a tray. Miss Marple smiled at her. "You've been busy," she said pleasantly. Emily flushed. "Mrs. Dane wanted things tidied." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "One does like order, especially after unpleasantness." She went upstairs slowly, her mind restless. The case appeared solved, yet the pieces did not sit comfortably together. The locked room had been dismissed too easily, the berry had appeared too conveniently, and Miss Plowden's fear had been of exposure, not of discovery. As she prepared for bed, a faint sound reached her ears, a soft footstep in the corridor, then another. Someone was moving quietly, carefully, as though the house were not yet done with secrets. Miss Marple paused, listening. The footsteps stopped. A door closed softly. Downstairs the false calm settled deeper, leaving the real danger untouched. The wrong victory had been claimed, and somewhere in the shadows of the vicarage, the true hand behind the crime waited, patient and watchful, for the moment when certainty would make everyone careless. Miss Marple slept. Lightly, her mind turning over small details the way other people counted sheep. When she woke before dawn, it was with the quiet certainty that something long buried had begun to stir. The false calm of the house lay heavy, but beneath it she sensed unease, not only about what had happened, but about what might yet be remembered. After breakfast she asked quite innocently whether Fernley kept old parish records. The vicar, grateful for any subject not connected directly to murder, brightened at once and led her to his study. There, among dusty shelves and neatly tied bundles, lay decades of village history. Miss Marple ran her fingers along spines and folders, pausing now and then as if guided by instinct rather than intention. "It's curious," she said softly, "how often trouble revisits the same places, even the same families." The vicar smiled faintly. "Human nature doesn't change much." "No," she agreed, "and neither do certain habits. She found what she was looking for not in the recent files, but in a yellowed envelope marked with a date nearly 30 years earlier. A coroner's report. A man found dead after a fall from a bridge outside the village, ruled an accident. The name leapt out at her, Plowden. Miss Plowden's father. The report was brief, clinical, but Miss Marple noticed the margin notes. Questions raised, quietly dismissed. Financial trouble. A partner who benefited from the death. A witness who changed her statement. The case had been closed without fuss, the village content to let the matter rest. She thanked the vicar and returned to the drawing-room, where Mrs. Dane was arranging flowers with unnecessary vigour. "How very kind of you to brighten things up," Miss Marple said. "One must do something," Mrs. Dane replied sharply. "I, for one, will be glad when all this is over." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "though I sometimes think the past dislikes Bain." She ignored. Mrs. Dane's hand stilled for just a moment before she resumed her work. "What do you mean by that?" "Oh, nothing in particular," Miss Marple said. "Only that Colonel Arbuthnot seems to have had a talent for reappearing in people's lives." Later, she spoke with the gardener, a taciturn man who had worked at Fernley for decades. She asked about the bridge, about old accidents, about families who had suffered losses. At first he shrugged, but then he mentioned, reluctantly, that Colonel Arbuthnot had been in the village once before, years ago, asking questions after the Plowden man died, questions that had made people uncomfortable. Colonel had a sharp memory, the gardener said, didn't forget faces or favours. That, Miss Marple thought, explained much. The Colonel had not come north by chance. He had returned with purpose, carrying old knowledge like a weapon. Blackmail was only the surface. Beneath it lay shared guilt. She gathered them that afternoon, not dramatically, but with the quiet authority she had developed over years of village life. Mrs. Dane sat stiffly, the vicar pale and anxious, Miss Plowden tense with dread. Colonel Arbuthnot knew about the bridge, Miss Marple said calmly. He knew it was not an accident. Mrs. Dane's breath caught. The vicar stared at his hands. "He was there," Miss Marple continued. "Not when the man fell, perhaps, but afterward. He helped ensure the truth stayed buried. In return, he expected loyalty. Silence. Assistance." Miss Plowden's voice broke. "My father was pushed," she said. "I always knew—" "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "And Colonel Arbuthnot knew too. He came back because he thought fear would protect him. Fear, however, had grown teeth. The pieces slid into place. Mrs. Dane's husband had been the business partner who benefited. The vicar's brother had helped smooth matters over. Each had built a life, the quiet understanding that the past would remain hidden. The Colonel's return threatened to tear it open. He never intended to leave, Miss Marple said. That is why he locked his door. He believed himself untouchable. Silence pressed in around them, thick with recognition. "And the holly?" the constable asked quietly, having entered unnoticed. "A symbol," Miss Marple replied, "of Christmas, of peace, but also of remembrance." Someone wanted the crime to look theatrical, insoluble. They wanted suspicion to fall where it was safest. Miss Plowden was never meant to be free, only convenient. As the truth surfaced, faces changed. What had seemed a simple murder now revealed itself as the final chapter of a long, carefully hidden story. The shadows of the past had reached forward, shaping the present with cruel precision. Miss Marple folded her hands. "You see," she said softly, "when sins are shared, so are secrets. And secrets, like guests, have a way of staying far longer than intended." Outside, the snow began to fall again, covering the village in white. But beneath it, the ground remembered everything. The revelation of the past unsettled the house more deeply than the accusation ever had. Afterward, people moved differently, as though the floors themselves remembered old footsteps. Miss Marple allowed the unease to settle. She knew better than to press too hard when nerves were already frayed. What she needed now was not confession, but confirmation. She found it in the most unlikely way, by asking for help with Christmas preparations. That afternoon she suggested, quite sweetly, that it would be a comfort to keep traditions despite everything. The vicar agreed at once, grateful for normality, and soon the drawing-room was alive with subdued activity. Holly was brought in again, candles sorted, ribbons untangled. Miss Marple placed herself at the centre of it, LL directing gently, observing constantly. "Do mind the berries," she said more than once. "They do have a way of going astray." Mrs. Dane insisted on arranging the mantelpiece herself. She had always been particular, she said, about symmetry. Miss Marple watched as the woman selected sprigs, discarding some, adjusting others with sharp, practiced movements. When she finished, the holly lay perfectly balanced, every berry accounted for. "Beautiful," Miss Marple said warmly. "Though I believe one sprig is missing a berry." Mrs. Dane stiffened. "Impossible." "Ah," said Miss Marple lightly. "Then perhaps I am mistaken." She moved on at once, leaving the remark hanging like a thread pulled loose. Later, she asked Emily to fetch a small bowl from the kitchen. When the girl returned, Miss Marple dropped into it several loose holly berries she had quietly collected from different rooms. "I thought we might count them," she said, "just for fun." "My eyesight isn't what it was." Emily smiled nervously and began. Mrs. Dane hovered nearby, her attention fixed despite herself. Miss Plowden watched too, her face pale but curious. When the counting was finished, Miss Marple nodded. "How odd," she said. "One extra." The room went very still. "Extra? Compared to what?" the constable asked, who had been standing by the door. "Compared to the sprigs brought in this morning," Miss Marple replied. "Emily was very clear on the number. She's an excellent girl, keeps track of such things." Emily nodded eagerly. "Yes, miss, I'm sure of it." Mrs. Dane laughed sharply. "This is absurd. What does an extra berry prove?" "Nothing," Miss Marple said at once, "unless one knows where it came from." She turned, almost absent-mindedly, and tipped the berries back into the bowl, except one. That one she rolled between her fingers, then let fall deliberately onto the rug by the hearth. It bounced once and me to rest near the edge, precisely where the colonel's body had lain. "There," she said. "If someone were standing here, bending perhaps, it would be quite easy to pocket such a thing, or to drop it later, when it was needed." Mrs. Dane's breath came fast now. "You're suggesting—" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that the berry found in Miss Plowden's pocket was planted, and that the person who planted it had ready access to holly, understood how to handle it, and knew exactly when suspicion would be most useful." The constable's gaze sharpened. Mrs. Dane arranged the decorations. She moved freely through the house. And, Miss Marple added, she had reason to direct attention away from herself. Her husband benefited from the first death. Colonel Arbuthnot's return threatened to expose that. Panic makes people clever, but not always careful. Mrs. Dane stepped back as though struck. "This is nonsense," she said, but the confidence was gone. "You can't prove any of it." Miss Marple smiled sadly. "No, but you can." She turned to the vicar. "I wonder if you would ask Mrs. Dane to show us the letter she finished yesterday afternoon, the one she said she posted." The vicar hesitated, then nodded. Mrs. Dane's hands trembled as she produced it. The ink, Miss Marple noted, was fresher than it should have been. "And now," Miss Marple said softly, "I think we shall find that the key to the blue guest room was not where it was said to be all afternoon, only where it needed to be found." Mrs. Dane's composure collapsed then, not into hysteria, but into something quieter and far more revealing, resignation. Her shoulders sagged, her eyes closed briefly. "He was never meant to die," she said, "only to be frightened, to leave—" "But he didn't," Miss Marple replied. "Guests like that never do." The unconventional test, a simple matter of berries, habits and nerves, had done what direct accusation could not. The crack had appeared, fine but unmistakable. As the constable stepped forward, Miss Marple turned away, her work finished. Outside, church bells began to ring for evening service, their sound clear and steady. Christmas, she thought, had a way of demanding truth, whether people were ready for it or not. Mrs. Dane was taken away quietly, wrapped in a shawl and stiff dignity, and for a brief moment the house seemed to breathe again. The constable spoke of formal charges, of statements to be written, of a case at last moving toward clarity. Yet Miss Marple felt no sense of completion. On the contrary, an uneasiness settled deeper, like a draught beneath a closed door. It began with the notebook, the colonel's small battered notebook, the one filled with names and dates, had been kept in the constable's temporary custody, locked in the sideboard drawer of the dining room. It was there that morning. By late afternoon, when Miss Marple asked to see it again, the drawer was empty. The constable stared at the bare wood in disbelief. He checked again, then a third time, his movements growing sharper. "That's not possible," he said. "I locked it myself." Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes had already moved to the fire. It had been laid afresh, she noticed, though no one had mentioned lighting it. The ashes were disturbed, not settled as they should have been. They sifted through the grate together. At first there was nothing but grey powder and the blackened remains of coal. Then the constable's fingers closed on something brittle. A fragment of paper, charred at the edges, the ink almost entirely gone. "Enough," Miss Marple said quietly. "We needn't look further." The destruction of the notebook changed everything. What had been a confession now became a race-saga. Deliberate erasure. Someone else, someone still free within the house, had known exactly what that notebook contained and had feared it. The constable straightened slowly. Mrs. Dane couldn't have done this. No, Miss Marple agreed. She had no need to any more. Which meant, quite plainly, that the crime had never belonged to her alone. The household was gathered again, but the atmosphere was very different now. Relief had evaporated. Suspicion, once focused, had scattered like spilled ink. The vicar sat rigid, his hands folded as if in prayer. Emily hovered near the door, eyes wide. Miss Plowden looked from face to face, realization dawning with horror. "You said," Miss Marple addressed the vicar gently, "that Colonel Arbuthnot helped smooth matters over after the bridge, that others were grateful." The vicar swallowed. "I never harmed him, I know," she said, "but you benefited from his silence. And when silence is threatened, people act." The constable's voice was tight. "Who had access to this room?" "All of us," Miss Marple replied, "at one point or another. That is precisely the difficulty." Trust thinned visibly. The servants avoided one another's eyes. The vicar's calm had fractured into nervous haste. Miss Plowden sat very still, as though afraid movement itself might condemn her. "It was clever," Miss Marple went on, "to let suspicion fall on Mrs. Dane. Cleverer still to destroy the one object that tied everyone else together." The gardener was questioned again, then the cook. Both denied entering the dining room. Emily hesitated, only briefly, before saying she had added coal to the fire earlier at Mrs. Dane's request. The timing was vague, the excuse was thin. Miss Marple watched her carefully. Emily's fear was not guilt, she decided, but loyalty. Loyalty could be bought or bred or demanded. "Emily," she said kindly, "who told you to do it?" "The Guy." RL burst into tears, shaking her head. "I didn't know," she sobbed. "I thought it was only rubbish. He said it would save trouble." "He?" the constable demanded. Emily looked helplessly at the vicar. The room went very quiet. The vicar rose abruptly. "This is intolerable," he said. "You are accusing—" "No," Miss Marple interrupted softly. "We are understanding. The notebook had named him. Perhaps not as a killer, but as a man who had once chosen peace over truth. When the colonel returned, that fragile peace shattered. The murder had solved one problem, but the notebook threatened to expose them all. "I never meant for anyone to die," the vicar said hoarsely. "I only wanted it ended." "And so," Miss Marple said, "you tried to end the story entirely." The constable moved toward him, but Miss Marple lifted a hand. "Not yet. There is still something missing." She looked again at the hearth, at the ashes clinging stubbornly to the grate. "Paper burns quickly," she said, "but leather does not." They searched once more thoroughly this time. Behind the fire screen, tucked where it might easily be overlooked, lay the scorched leather cover of the notebook, its edges blackened but intact. Inside, one page remained, a single name written with desperate force. Miss Marple read it, then closed the cover gently. The truth, it seemed, had survived its attempted burial. But as she looked up, she realized the cost. Whoever had tried to erase the evidence was still very close enough to strike again if cornered. The house, stripped now of certainty, felt dangerous in a new way. The evidence had vanished, yes, but not entirely. And in its absence, the final reckoning drew nearer, sharper, and far more perilous than before. The name on the surviving page hung in Miss Marple's mind like a tolling bell, too heavy to speak aloud just yet. She closed the scorched cover and slipped it into her handbag, not furtively, but with the quiet assurance of someone who understood the danger of letting truth lie unguarded. The constable noticed but did not object. By now, he trusted her instincts more than his own procedures. Night came early again, and with it an uneasy truce. The household was instructed to remain in their rooms after supper. No one protested. Fear had replaced indignation, and certainty had evaporated entirely. The vicarage, once warm and crowded, now felt hollow, each corridor a potential hiding place for secrets that refused to die. Miss Marple retired early, though she did not sleep. She sat by the window, knitting untouched in her lap, listening. Houses spoke at night, she had learned, through creaks, sighs, the rhythm of footsteps that did not quite belong. Somewhere after midnight she heard one. It was careful, too careful. The sound moved along the corridor outside her door, paused, then continued toward the east wing. Miss Marple rose, slipped on her dressing gown and opened her door a fraction. The corridor lay in shadow, but at its far end a thin line of light glowed beneath the blue guest-room door. Her heart tightened. That room had been sealed again. No one was meant to enter it. She stepped forward quietly, every sense alert. As she reached the turn in the corridor, a sound broke the silence. Not a footstep, but a muffled cry. Then came a thud, heavy and final. Miss Marple did not hesitate. She turned and rang the bell rope sharply, once, twice, 3 times, the emergency signal the servants knew well. Doors opened along the corridor. Voices rose in alarm. The constable appeared, half-dressed, his face already grim. They reached the blue guest-room together. The door was ajar. Inside, the fire had been lit again, flames licking hungrily. On the rug near the hearth lay the vicar, crumpled at an unnatural angle, his face grey, his spectacles shattered beside him. Blood darkened his temple where he had struck the corner of the mantel. "He's alive," Constable said quickly, kneeling. "But only just—" Miss Marple's gaze swept the room. The scene was wrong in familiar ways. The rug had shifted again. The writing desk drawers were open, and on the mantelpiece beside the holly sprig lay her handbag, up-ended. The notebook cover was gone. "So," she said quietly, "it was you he came for." The vicar was carried away, unconscious but breathing. The household gathered once more, shaken to the core. This was no longer a matter of uncovering the past. Someone had tried to kill again, had nearly succeeded, and had done so boldly, recklessly. Miss Plowden clutched the back of a chair. "He came here to destroy the page," she whispered. "The name." "Yes," Miss Marple said, and to silence the one man who could confirm it. The constable's voice was hard now. "Who knew you had it, Miss Marple?" she considered. "Only those present in the dining room, but only one person would believe violence was the last remaining solution." As if summoned by the words, a scream rang out from below, high, raw, terrified. "Emily!" They ran downstairs to the servants' hall, where the parlour-maid stood shaking, pointing toward the pantry. Inside, the cook lay slumped against the shelves, her eyes staring, her face ashen. A heavy candlestick lay nearby, streaked with blood. She tried to stop him. Emily sobbed. She saw him go to Miss Marple's room earlier. She said she'd tell. The constable straightened slowly. "Who, Emily?" Emily's lips trembled. "The gardener. They found him moments later, attempting to leave through the back door, his boots already on, snow clinging to his coat. When confronted, he did not deny it. There was no point now. He promised me money," he said dully, "years ago, to say nothing about the bridge. Then the colonel came back and everything started again. Mrs. Dane panicked. The vicar panicked. But I was the one who finished it." Miss Marple looked at him sadly. "You thought destroying words would destroy guilt." He laughed bitterly. "Words last longer than people." The second attack changed everything. What had been a careful, concealed crime had become desperate and exposed. The gardener was taken away. The cook survived, barely. The vicar lived, though the truth he would wake to was heavier than any injury. As dawn broke at last, pale and cold over Fernley, Miss Marple sat once more in the drawing-room, exhaustion finally settling into her bones. Christmas bells would ring soon. The village would wake believing the danger past. But Miss Marple knew better. Evil, when cornered, lashed out, and it was only by chance, and a sleepless old woman's instincts, that it had not claimed one more life before Christmas. With the gardener gone and the house finally quiet, exhaustion settled over Fernley like a second snowfall. Lamps burned low, voices were hushed, and no one spoke unless necessary. Yet Miss Marple felt more awake than she had in days. Chaos, she knew, often disguised order, and it was in the aftermath, when people believed the danger had passed, that patterns revealed themselves. She asked to sit once more in the blue guest room. The constable hesitated, then agreed. The fire was allowed to die this time, leaving the room colder, more honest somehow. Miss Marple seated herself carefully, gazing about her with renewed attention. Nothing here was new to her now. Every object had been examined, discussed, doubted, and yet something still felt incomplete, not missing, but misunderstood. It was the rug that held her attention again. Not its position, nor the way it had shifted during each incident, but its pattern, a faded geometric design, worn thin at the centre, darker along the edges. Miss Marple bent closer, tracing it with her eyes. The rug had been cleaned recently, too recently for a guest room rarely used before the Colonel's arrival. "Who arranged for this room?" she asked quietly. Mrs. Dane's voice answered from the doorway, brittle with fatigue. "I did. It seemed only proper." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "And you're very particular. I noticed that—" She stood slowly and walked to the writing desk. One drawer still bore faint scratches along its inner edge, the sort left when something heavy was repeatedly removed and replaced. A strong-box, perhaps, or a bundle of papers. The notebook was never his most valuable possession, Miss Marple murmured. Only his most convenient one. The constable frowned. "Then what were we really looking for?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not what, where?" She crossed to the window and looked down into the garden. The holly bush stood bare now, its branches stripped for decoration. Beneath it, half hidden by snow, lay a small patch of disturbed earth. "I wondered," she said, "why Colonel Arbuthnot insisted on this particular room. Not the warmest, not the prettiest. But it does have one advantage." The constable followed her gaze. Understanding dawned slowly. "Access to the garden and privacy," Miss Marple added. He could come and go unnoticed. They went outside together, crunching through snow, until they reached the disturbed ground. A quick search revealed a tin box wrapped in oilcloth, buried shallowly beneath the roots. Inside were papers, ledgers, letters, affidavits, proof of the bridge, proof of payment, proof of complicity, names carefully recorded, dates cross-checked, a man's insurance policy, buried where he believed no one would think to look. "The pattern," Miss Marple said softly, "was always there. He stayed because he needed to stay close to this. He locked the room because he feared discovery. He staged the holly because he believed symbolism distracted from substance." The constable let out a slow breath. "And we chased berries and locked doors, because that is what he wanted," she replied gently. "A puzzle too clever to be simple." Everything fell into place then. Mrs. Dane's panic, the vicar's desperation, the gardener's loyalty. The second attack had not been about silencing Miss Marple. It had been about protecting what remained hidden just a little longer. But fear had made the culprit careless. They had looked up when the truth lay beneath their feet. As the papers were gathered, the weight of finality settled in. There would be trials, confessions, reckonings. The village would change. It always did, after truth surfaced. Inside again, Miss Marple sat quietly while the constable made arrangements. Her hands trembled slightly now, the delayed response of fatigue. Miss Plowden approached her hesitantly. "Thank you," she said, "for not stopping when it became complicated." Miss Marple smiled at her. "My dear, it is always complicated. People simply prefer not to notice." The bells began to ring outside, clear and bright in the cold air. Christmas Eve had come at last. Miss Marple listened, content now, not with victory, but with understanding. The key to the case had never been the locked room, nor the missing berry, nor even the violence that followed. It had been habit, old sins repeated, old fears revived, old patterns resumed, and like all patterns, once seen it could not be unseen. The guest had never left before Christmas because the past rarely did, but at last it had been brought into the light, where even the longest shadows finally gave way. Miss Marple remained in the blue guest room long after the constable had left to secure the recovered documents and summon additional assistance. The room was quiet now, the chaos of the night replaced by an almost oppressive stillness. Yet in that stillness she company. Ould feel the final piece of the puzzle stirring, a subtle presence that had remained hidden until now. She did not need to speak, she only needed to observe, to let the weight of the events settle and reveal their true meaning. She began by examining the papers in the tin box, noting the careful way Colonel Arbuthnot had recorded every transaction, every promise, every debt owed to him or by him over decades. The surface motive, the blackmail, the fear of exposure, the financial entanglements, was evident enough. But as Miss Marple read the faint pencil notes, the coded references to past grievances, the mentions of old misdeeds that had never been punished, something deeper emerged. It was not money he sought, nor revenge in its ordinary sense. He wanted acknowledgement, recognition of slights, debts, and unpunished wrongs. He was a man obsessed with moral accounting, far beyond the simple ledger of coin and property. Her thoughts returned to Mrs. Dane, whose panic had precipitated so much of the recent violence. She had reacted not only to the threat of financial ruin, but to the resurrection of a past carefully buried. And then there was the gardener, who had struck in desperation, not greed. The motive was no longer a sequence of transactions, it was a psychological architecture built over decades, a web of fear, shame, and unacknowledged guilt. Miss Marple recalled the careful placement of the holly, the berry in Miss Plowden's pocket, the staged locked room. The Colonel had been meticulous, knowing precisely how to manipulate people by exploiting their fears. It was not merely the desire to frighten or intimidate. He took a dark satisfaction in watching secrets emerge under pressure. And yet, the ultimate aim had been subtle, to ensure that people confronted the moral consequences of their actions in his own relentless terms. She walked to the window and looked at the snow-laden garden. The Colonel had never intended to leave. He had believed himself morally superior, a custodian of truth, a master of human frailty. And when people had acted out of fear, when Mrs. Dane had panicked, when the vicar had intervened, when the gardener had struck, it was all part of the same tragic chain he had set in motion. The crime was not a simple act of passion or greed. It was the culmination of an obsession with moral accounting, an obsession that demanded compliance, attention, and ultimately fear. Miss Marple's mind went back to the vicar's testimony about the bridge years ago, and the quiet complicity that had allowed an accidental death to remain unexamined. It all converged in this moment. The Colonel had returned not for revenge in the conventional sense, but to impose an invisible sentence on those he believed morally culpable. He was orchestrating not just an investigation, but a psychological reckoning, and for him, the stakes had always been higher than life or death, though death became inevitable when people failed to meet his exacting expectations. Her eyes fell on the vicar's trembling hands, the way he had nearly struck her own curiosity when confronted, the haunted fear in Miss Plowden's eyes. These were not ordinary fears, she realized. They were reflections of a deeper moral terror. The Colonel had tapped into the conscience, using secrets and guilt as instruments of power far more effective than any weapon. That was why he had manipulated, deceived, and instilled panic. He understood, far better than the others, the human capacity for self-deception, and he had wielded it ruthlessly. Miss Marple finally understood why the notebook, so meticulously maintained, had been the central object of the gardener's last desperate act. Destroying it was an attempt not merely to protect financial secrets, but to erase the Colonel's invisible judgments, to prevent exposure of long-buried truths. That was why fear had driven ordinary people to extraordinary actions. They had been trapped, morally and psychologically, by a man who had no need for ordinary motives. She folded the scorched cover carefully and placed it back into her handbag, her mind clear. The crime had been a manifestation of a hidden morality, twisted, obsessive, and unforgiving, and the reason it had escalated to such extremes was the villain's psychological compulsion to observe, to test, to judge, and if necessary, to terrorize, all in the name of a perverse sense of order. Miss Marple rose and walked to the hearth. The fire had died down, leaving only the faint warmth of embers. She looked at the faces of the household, now gathered cautiously, weary and expectant. She would explain, in time, the intricate connections and reveal the truth to the constable and authorities. But first, she allowed herself a quiet moment of reflection. The crime had been solved, yes, but the revelation of motive was far more profound and disturbing. The Colonel had sought to impose moral accounting, and in doing so, he had unravelled the hidden lives of everyone around him, and that, Miss Marple knew, was the deepest danger of all. Miss Marple spent the morning in quiet preparation, arranging the room as carefully as she had observed Colonel Arbuthnot arranging holly and ledgers. She had learned that the final confrontation required subtlety more than force, patience more than speed. By the afternoon the household gathered again, each person uneasy, their nerves stretched tight from fear and exhaustion. The vicar had recovered enough to sit upright, though his hands still shook. Miss Plowden hovered near the window, reluctant to draw attention, while the servants remained close to the door, each aware that a truth long concealed was about to surf. "Ace!" Miss Marple called everyone together in the drawing-room, her voice calm, almost casual, but carrying the authority of years spent observing human nature. She began by reviewing the sequence of events, speaking slowly, emphasizing small, deliberate details that had previously gone unnoticed. The locked room, the holly berry, the second attack, the scorched notebook. Each piece was laid out plainly. No accusation yet, only observation. And yet, she said softly, for all our attention, the crucial piece remained hidden in plain sight. Someone among us understood this truth and tried desperately to prevent it from surfacing. Eyes shifted uneasily. A faint colour rose in Mrs. Dane's cheeks, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. The gardener had been removed, the vicar was still recovering, and Emily fidgeted near the door, wringing her hands. Miss Marple paused before the mantel, letting her gaze sweep across the room as though the furniture itself were conspiring to reveal the culprit. "You see," she continued, "the papers in this tin, the ledger that was nearly destroyed, they were never about money alone. They revealed guilt, collusion, and fear, and someone feared exposure so intensely that violence seemed the only recourse." Her words hung in the air, drawing tension as taut as a wire. Then she stepped closer to Mrs. Dane, her eyes gentle but unyielding. "Do you understand now, my dear, why Miss Plowden feared for her life? Why the gardener acted as he did?" Mrs. Dane's hands tightened, and for a moment her composure wavered. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then finally spoke, her voice low. I only wanted to protect him. To protect us all. The Colonel, he threatened everything. I feared exposure. That was all." Miss Marple nodded, not triumphantly, but with quiet understanding. "Yes. And yet the measures taken, to destroy evidence, to silence those around you, only deepened the peril." The vicar, still pale, interjected cautiously. "So you were behind the second attack? The fire in my room?" Mrs. Dane's eyes darted briefly, then she nodded. "I thought, if the notebook was gone, the past would stay buried. I never meant anyone to get hurt." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Intent is a delicate thing. And yet," she said, "it does not erase consequence. The danger escalated because desperation clouds judgment." The room was quiet, the weight of confession filling the space. Miss Plowden's eyes shimmered with tears, the constable's jaw was tight with controlled frustration, and Emily's hands shook as she clutched the back of a chair. "Now," Miss Marple said, turning back to the group, "the question remains, how do we ensure that what has been uncovered is preserved, that truth is not further manipulated?" Mrs. Dane swallowed hard. "By telling it," she admitted. "By telling everything." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Exactly. And that," she said, "is why we act carefully. Because justice is not merely catching the guilty, it is ensuring that the story is complete, the accounts balanced, and that fear can no longer dictate action." For the first time since the chaos began, the room seemed to exhale. The threat of further violence had passed, the pattern was clear, the hidden motives revealed. Miss Marple had set the trap not with physical barriers, but with patience, observation, and the inevitability of truth. Those who had sought to manipulate events had now cornered themselves with their own actions, forced into revelation by the constancy of her quiet attention. Mrs. Dane sank into a chair, tears running freely now. The vicar's shoulders relaxed slightly. Even Emily, still trembling, began to breathe more steadily. The constable stepped forward, relieved, his notebook open, ready to record the confessi. Ons that would finally bring clarity. Miss Marple remained standing for a moment longer, surveying the faces of those she had guided through fear, deception, and revelation. She had waited, observed, and understood. And now, at last, the last desperate moves had been made, and the threads of the tangled story lay fully exposed, ready for the reckoning that would bring the house at last peace. The room had settled into an uneasy calm, the confessions and explanations having drawn a neat arc through the tangled web of deceit. Mrs. Dane wept quietly, the vicar regained some composure, and the constable was already making notes for formal statements. Miss Plowden remained at the window, shivering slightly, yet with the faintest glimmer of relief in her eyes. It seemed, for the first time since the chaos began, that the nightmare was ending. Miss Marple, however, felt a faint tremor of unease. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it tugged at the corners of her mind like a shadow refusing to settle. She looked around the room, her eyes resting briefly on the fireplace, the holly decorations, the scorched notebook, now safely returned to its tin. Everything appeared accounted for, yet something felt off. She rose and walked slowly toward the sideboard where the constable had been keeping the recovered ledger. "May I see it one more time?" she asked, her voice soft. The constable nodded, opening the tin carefully. Miss Marple's fingers hovered over the papers. As she examined the entries again, a familiar sequence of dates and names caught her attention. Not the obvious transactions, but the marginal notes, tiny and precise, almost invisible unless one knew what to look for. Her eyes narrowed as a realization struck. "They've all been careful, yes," she murmured, "but not careful enough." The constable glanced at her. "I don't follow, Miss Marple." "Look here," she said, pointing to a series of initials scrawled alongside the oldest entries. Every incident, every accident, every period of silence. It was overseen, coordinated, and yet the name we assumed responsible was only a figurehead. The real hand has been hiding in plain sight all along. She turned slowly to face the group. Their faces mirrored confusion, uncertainty, and exhaustion. Mrs. Dane blinked, the colour draining from her cheeks. "You mean—" "It wasn't me?" "Not entirely," Miss Marple said, shaking her head. "You acted out of panic, not orchestration. The gardener, too, he was driven by loyalty, not strategy. The vicar was afraid, but he was never the architect. Someone else has been guiding events, observing, waiting for the right moment to strike or to manipulate." A heavy silence fell. Emily clutched the back of a chair. "Who, Miss Marple? Who could it be?" Miss Marple's eyes swept the room, lingering on the smallest details. The slight crease in the vicar's collar, the careful avoidance of her gaze by a particular figure in the corner, the way Mrs. Dane's hands trembled even as she sat down. Then, almost casually, she asked, "Mrs. Dane, did you ever notice how closely someone attended to Colonel Arbuthnot's possessions before his death? How often the keys, the notes, even the holly arrangements were adjusted?" Mrs. Dane looked confused. "Well, yes, but I thought it was just him being meticulous." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly, "so you did not realize who had been mimicking him, anticipating his moves, preparing for every eventuality?" The vicar, pale, leaned forward. "Miss Marple, are you saying it's someone we've all known, someone we trusted?" "Yes," she replied. "Someone who understood the house, the habits of those within it, and the way fear could be manipulated. Someone whose presence was never questioned because it was familiar." The air in the room grew. Heavier. Every pair of eyes shifted, seeking a face, a gesture, a tell. Miss Marple's gaze fell finally on Emily. The girl looked up, startled, frightened, but not merely from being singled out. There was something in her stance, a quiet control, a steadiness that had gone unnoticed amidst the chaos. "Emily," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but unwavering, "you were there each time a crucial event occurred. You knew when the notebook would be moved, when the second attack was possible, when the ledger's discovery could tip suspicion. You were present in every moment that seemed coincidental." Emily's hands trembled, but her eyes did not waver. I only did as I was told," she whispered. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes piercing. "And who gave the instructions, Emily? The one who orchestrated fear, guided panic, and manipulated the reactions of everyone else?" The girl's lips parted, then closed again. A pause stretched unbearably. Finally she spoke, the words coming like reluctant confession. "It wasn't only one person. But yes, I was the last to act, the one who ensured things went as needed." The room erupted into gasps and disbelief. Mrs. Dane clutched the vicar's arm. The constable drew a sharp breath. Miss Plowden's hand went to her mouth. Miss Marple remained composed, her mind racing quietly. The final twist was cruelly elegant. The real mastermind had not been the obvious villain, nor the panicked accomplices. It had been someone assumed too innocent, too small, too invisible, who had patiently waited while the larger players moved themselves into position. The chaos, the attacks, the panic, all were manipulated to protect a hidden agenda, one that was as psychological as it was practical. Every pattern, Miss Marple said softly, every false clue, every misdirection. It was meant to distract, to mislead, to allow the true orchestrator to remain unseen. But now, Emily, the game is up. The truth can no longer be hidden. And justice, she paused, letting the words settle like a final bell, must be completed. The final revelation hung over the room, heavier than any confession yet. The house, which had seen so much panic and fear, now felt exposed, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Miss Marple's genius had been tested to its limits, yet the case was not just solved, it was fully illuminated, every shadow now cast into sharp, undeniable clarity. The household sat in a tense hush, the weight of Emily's reluctant confession pressing down like a snow-laden branch. The constable's notebook lay open on the table, pens poised, ready to record every word. Mrs. Dane's hands trembled, the vicar's pale features were drawn tight, and even Miss Plowden, usually so composed, had a faint quiver at her lips. Miss Marple, standing quietly by the fireplace, watched them all, her calm a steady counterpoint to the storm of revelation. "It is unusual," she said at last, her voice soft but precise, "for someone so seemingly unremarkable to manipulate events so thoroughly. And yet it is exactly what has occurred." She gestured toward Emily. The gardener, Mrs. Dane, even the vicar, each acted under pressure, but the pressure itself was carefully applied. That pressure came from someone who understood habits, routines, and fear, and who knew precisely how to direct them. Emily lowered her head, tears shining in her eyes. "I didn't know it would go this far," she whispered. "I thought I was just helping." "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently, "and that is why the house was nearly lost to panic. Actions, even seemingly small ones, have consequences when guided by another's hidden hand." She moved toward the sideboard and picked up the scorched leather notebook. "Consider this, every clue we observed, every odd movement, every misdirection, it was designed to distract from the true orchestrator. The berry, the locked room, the fire, the second attack, they were steps in a chain that only a careful observer could piece together." The constable's pen hovered as he listened, realizing that the case had been far more complex than he had imagined. "Miss Marple, you mean we never truly knew who held the reins?" "Not until now," she said, "and even today the full consequences of these actions are only just beginning to unfold." She turned toward Emily, who now looked almost defiant despite the tears. "Emily," she said, "do you understand what you must do next?" The girl swallowed hard. I must tell everything. To the authorities, to everyone involved. There's no other way." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Truth is the only safeguard against further harm." The constable stepped forward, nodding gravely. "We will ensure she is heard, and that any further actions are recorded. But Miss Marple, the real mastermind, can we trust that justice will reach her?" Miss Marple's gaze was steady, unflinching. "Justice," she said softly, "depends on the law. But the law only acts on evidence, and in this case the evidence exists because the orchestrator underestimated observation." She tapped the notebook lightly. "We know now what to present. We know the patterns, the manipulations, the hidden motives. And that is why it is possible to act decisively even after so much deception." Yet, even as the words left her lips, a flicker of unease lingered in the room. Emily's confession was complete. Yet there was a shadow behind her eyes, a careful calculation that hinted she understood far more than she revealed. The constable noticed it too, though he did not speak, and Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, almost imperceptible nod. "Remember," she said, addressing the entire room, "there are always lessons in what we overlook. The simplest habit, the faintest expression, the smallest object out of place, these can reveal the deepest truths. That is what has guided us through the maze of this house." Mrs. Dane exhaled shakily. "So, it is truly over?" "For now," Miss Marple said. "The law will take its course and the orchestrator's influence has been exposed. But one must never forget, cleverness can endure, even when seemingly contained. And vigilance, observation, and patience are the only means to counter it. The vicar leaned back, eyes weary but clear. It seems almost miraculous that it all came to light. Miss Marple shook her head lightly. Not miraculous, merely attentive. The clues were always there, scattered like snowflakes in plain sight. Some fell where they were noticed, others required careful gathering. The danger now is that when people believe the story finished, they relax. And it is in that relaxation that the cleverest of minds may still find opportunity. The household slowly exhaled, a fragile relief settling over them. The immediate danger had passed. The conspiracies and manipulations were laid bare, and justice could now take its course. Yet Miss Marple knew, as she had known all along, that cleverness and misjudgment often walk hand in hand, and that human nature sometimes leaves room for one last quiet deception. She returned the notebook to its tin, setting it on the sideboard where it could not be missed again. Outside, the first light of Christmas morning began to creep over the snowy landscape. The bells from the nearby church rang clearly, but inside Fernley, a subtle tension remained, the memory of manipulation lingering. Miss Marple stood quietly, knitting still untouched, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the fire. Justice had been delivered, but she understood that some threads of cunning, once woven, never entirely unravel. In the heart of Fernley, peace had returned, but the knowledge of what had been orchestrated and by whom would leave a lasting imprint. Observing, always observing, Miss Marple had once more proven that the truth, though delayed, could not ultimately be concealed. Yet she allowed herself a small, private thought. Vigilance, even at Christmas, was never wasted. The first light of Christmas morning spilled across the snow-covered lawns of Fernley, casting a soft glow through the windows of the vicarage. Inside, the household moved with cautious relief, each member attending to small domestic tasks, the chaos of the past days lingering in quiet gestures. A nervously wrung hand, a glance over the shoulder, a whispered word shared between the vicar and Miss Plowden. The immediate danger had passed, the ledger recovered, the orchestrator exposed, and yet Miss Marple felt the familiar subtle tug of unease. She walked slowly through the rooms, observing the aftermath with the patient attention of a gardener inspecting the soil after a storm. Every detail had its place. The scorched notebook returned to its tin, the fire freshly tended, the holly stripped from the mantel to avoid further distraction. Even so, there was one thing that drew her attention, a small incongruity that she had not noticed until now. On the sideboard, among the recovered papers, lay a tiny scrap of vellum, folded with care. It was nothing remarkable at first glance, an old, faded piece, corners frayed, but when she unfolded it, the letters were familiar, written in a delicate hand, one that she had seen before but not fully registered. The initials matched none of the household's current occupants. Miss Marple held it close, eyes narrowing, as she deciphered a cryptic me. Sage, not all debts are settled. The past waits. Her lips pressed together in a thin line. It was not a threat, nor a promise of violence. It was a quiet reminder, a whisper from someone watching still, someone whose presence had not yet been revealed. The neatness of the writing suggested patience, control, and a mind that delighted in subtleties. She glanced around the room, at the faces of those now quietly resuming their domestic rhythms, and felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle half complete. The constable appeared at the doorway, ready to take the final statements. "Miss Marple," he said, nodding toward the scrap of paper, "are we missing anything else?" She shook her head, but her mind was already tracing possibilities. "Not missing, only delayed," she said enigmatically. "Sometimes the smallest detail reveals a continuation of a story we believed concluded. We have resolved the immediate dangers, yes, but one must always watch for the faintest ripple that hints at a larger current." Mrs. Dane, still pale but composed, looked at her curiously. "Do you mean someone else?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling. "Perhaps. Or perhaps a message left by one who wished us to know that even when the threads appear tied, a loose end remains. We have justice, yes, and we have clarity, but one cannot assume that the world's cleverness has ended with a single victory." The vicar moved closer, curiosity tempered by exhaustion. "Then what do we do now?" "We observe," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm and certain. "We continue as we always do. The lessons learned here will guide us. and the faintest signs of anomaly will not escape notice. She folded the scrap of vellum carefully and tucked it into her handbag, a silent promise to return to it when the time was right. As she stepped toward the door to leave Fernley, the household paused in respectful quiet, their eyes reflecting gratitude, relief, and lingering uncertainty. She paused at the threshold, casting a final glance over the familiar rooms now transformed by events. The snow outside glimmered, untouched and serene, yet she knew that beneath its white calm, human secrets and unseen motives still waited. Walking down the path, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted over the chain of events, the meticulous planning, the human frailties, the almost imperceptible patterns that had guided her through the case. She understood now, as she had countless times before, that no matter how complete a story seemed, there would always be questions lurking in corners, whispers in the shadows, and small, overlooked details that could spark the next mystery. A crow called from the distant trees, its cry echoing across the snow-laden fields. Miss Marple paused for a moment, listening, then smiled faintly. The case of the guest who never left before Christmas had reached its conclusion, but even as she walked away, she knew that some secrets, some unfinished threads remained. They were the pulse of the world, subtle, persistent, and endlessly intriguing. And so, with the soft crunch of snow beneath her feet and the weight of observation ever in her mind, Miss Marple disappeared down the lane, leaving Fernley behind, satisfied yet alert, ready for whatever the next shadow might reveal. The story had ended, yet the mystery never truly would.